I just want to tell you a little bit about Risa and kind of her time here and how important she was in terms of the research that she's done for not only just Pacific Northwest dunes, but also for trying to understand species invasion. So Risa got a bachelor's degree in environmental science from Western Washington University in 2020. So right before, well, maybe right during the pandemic. And she actually, during her time as a student, she did a lot of research undergrad sort of experiences. She did an REU, University of Michigan, she lived in dunes. And then she did a Noah Holling scholarship at Lake Superior, where she worked kind of on wetland restoration. So she had a lot of kind of fieldwork, plant skills when she came to the lab. And she also got a Udall scholarship during her time as an undergrad, which was also very, very impressive. After graduating, she actually came directly to OSU, so she didn't have a break in between those two academic experiences. So I'm sure she's going to be looking forward to the break that she's going to have after this. So when Risa got here, obviously the pandemic has started, so it's very uncertain time. And I give her a lot of credit because she really just sort of worked through that. You know, she was at home a lot, not knowing people here in Corvallis, so you know, it was a difficult time. But Risa really combined her interest in environmental science with a really strong GIS background, and she was able to, you know, fit in to the research that we were doing in our lab really well. What she looked at was kind of the next steps in terms of understanding pervasiveness and invasion potential of this newly discovered invasive beach grass, which is going to talk about today. And Risa embraced the vigors of dune fieldwork and also team leadership. She walked many, many miles of the dunes of Oregon and Washington over 2 summers, and she also mentored half a dozen undergrads in our lab, which is just an incredible amount of work. And as you'll see, she collected some really, really important data that's going to help us understand kind of basic knowledge about hybridization and how it affects invasion potential, but then also this is a huge management concern, so all of her data will be very useful from that perspective. She was also an enthusiastic helper of other people especially during the pandemic. So she helped a lot of people doing field work, and she also participated in a pretty big experimental project that we had going. And so she was indispensable for a lot of people. So give her a lot of credit for that. And Risa also was able to create inspiring maps, and she also used her Photoshop skills, you'll see later, in trying to make us stuff during a very stressful time. There's the photo that you will see later. Risa was also award-winning and very service-centric to our department. She received a Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center Fellowship, which is a fellowship that you have to apply to and write a grant for. So it's really pretty impressive. She also was a Sea Grant Science Communicator Fellow and worked with high school students to produce curriculum for on dunes and dune ecology. She won multiple first place awards for talks and posters that she gave at meetings. She also was a Presidential Management Fellowship scholar. She did a OMSI Science Communication Fellowship. And then she also trained post-watch volunteers to identify the hybrid, and also gave a lot of talks about the hybrid to the local public and also these volunteers. So she did a lot of communicating of her science, and you'll see today that she's very good at that. And she has an exciting future. She just accepted a position with the Port of Seattle. She's going to be an environmental scientist for Port of Seattle. So they're gaining a really wonderful. Risa, take it away. You can introduce your talk. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all so much for being here today. It's great to see so many folks on Zoom and in the audience supporting me. Yeah, I'm really excited to share this research that I've been working on over the last 3 years, which is about this newly discovered invasive beach grass hybrid on Pacific Northwest coastal dunes. And I'll be talking about my findings in terms of its range, abundance, spread, and also some of the biophysical impacts that it'll have on coastal dunes. Okay. There are tons of invasive species around us, and they're just getting greater in number as humans introduce them to more places, and some also expand their ranges because of climate change. So for instance, in Oregon, we have tons of Scotch broom, this plant with big yellow flowers on the top left. This bottom left photo is a plant, I think it's knotweed, that grew under the floorboards of the house I was living in and up into the vent of my house. So they're very persistent and good at what they do. And sometimes they're really difficult and costly to remove. So as someone who's done a lot of invasive blackberry removal, I can feel the thorns even just by looking at this picture. So they're this huge management concern. And a specific group of invasive species that are often particularly concerning are ecosystem engineers, which are organisms that physically alter the habitat around them by modifying their environment. And this can have cascading consequences that can linger far longer than the effects of the organism themselves. So for instance, this is Spartina anglica, or this common cordgrass, that accretes sediment and stabilizes marshes, so it alters its environment. And the study system in which I'll be talking about invasive species and ecosystem engineers are Pacific Northwest coastal dunes, which is this beautiful, dynamic ecosystem and is also really widespread in Oregon and Washington. So on the right are all the areas in red that are dune-backed sandy beaches. So it's pretty extensive. This dune state looked really different also just 100 years ago. It was open and shifting and destabilized, and also covered with this high diversity of native plant species. So some I want to point out are our only native dune grass, American dune grass, or Laemus mollus, as well as the western snowy plover. And this changed pretty dramatically when 2 species of beach grass were introduced beginning in the early 1900s by settlers who came to Oregon. And they introduced 2 different species, which are Ammophila breviligulata, which I'll abbreviate as AMBER throughout the talk, or American beach grass, and Ammophila arenaria, or AMAR, which is also European beach grass is its common name. And I'll continue the convention used in our lab to make Ammophila breviligulata blue throughout the talk and Ammophila arenaria red. These 2 beach grasses are ecosystem engineers, and they build dunes through this 2-way biophysical feedback between sand supply and deposition and vegetation. And so how that works in simple terms is that sand is deposited on the beach grasses. They grow a certain way in response. And that growth response then impacts how sand is deposited. And this feedback over time eventually leads to dunes of specific shapes and sizes, or geomorphology. And this is the effects that those beach grasses had along the coast. So they transformed the open, shifting ecosystem I showed earlier into these highly stabilized dunes, or parallel ridges of sand. This also had really significant management trade-offs for coastal communities. So the beach grasses were really good at what they were intended to do, which was to stabilize sediment and form dunes that increase the level of protection from storms and sea level rise. And it's part of the reason that we're able to build so close to the coastline. But they also had drawbacks too. So as you can see in this example picture, the dunes are now much more homogeneous, and the beach grasses are implicated in the decline of some native species. So there's these trade-offs when we think about the effects of the beach grasses. Complicating the story further is that there's two different species, and they differ in several key ways that I'll talk about, which are really important for the story. One of the ways they differ, you can see through this photo right here. Ammophila breviligulata has these thicker stems that grow more sparsely and also more laterally, whereas Ammophila arenaria has these thin stems that grow vertically and also more densely. And because of that biophysical feedback that I mentioned earlier, the two species also produce dunes of different geomorphologies. So Ammophila arenaria typically forms taller and narrower dunes compared to Ammophila breviligulata, which typically forms shorter and wider dunes. Another way they differ is through the level of species richness that they're associated with. So Ammophila arenaria has been found to have greater species richness, while Ammophila breviligulata often has less associated species richness. And then the last way that I'll talk about for their differences is their geographic ranges. Ammophila arenaria is present across the Pacific coast, but is dominant in California and southern Oregon, whereas Ammophila breviligulata starts to show up around northern Oregon, but is dominant through Washington and Canada. All right, and now I want to transition into the main part of the talk, which is about the hybridization of these two beach grasses. And that story started when within this range overlap, and specifically where the dominance in beach grasses shifts from Ammophila arenaria to breviligulata, there was this new and unusual beach grass found by members of the research group I'm part of. It had certain morphology or traits that were intermediate between Ammophila arenaria and Ammophila breviligulata, and they wondered if it was a hybrid beach grass. My former lab mate, Dr. Rebecca Mostow, investigated this question, is the beach grass a hybrid, for the first chapter of her PhD. She looked into the genetics and morphology of the grasses and confirmed that, yes, the two parent beach grasses are breeding, forming this hybrid beach grass that's present along the coast. And this was a really significant discovery and led to this whole slew of other questions about the hybrid. And you'll see Rebecca's name and picture throughout this talk because she did so much of this foundational work with the hybrid that paved the way for these research questions that I asked. Some of Rebecca's other findings about the hybrid included identifying traits, which are the hybrid's blade width and ligule length. The ligule is this thin piece of tissue at the base of leaves. Ammophila arenaria has this tall and thin ligule. Ammophila breviligulata has this short and flat ligule, and the hybrid's ligule is somewhere between the two parents. Rebecca also did initial searches for the hybrid and found, as of 2019, 21 hybrid individuals, which I'll call hybrid patches throughout this talk. And so Rebecca did other work too about the genetics and competitive ability, but there were still a lot of unknowns that we had about this hybrid and what it might mean for coastal dunes. So for instance, we really didn't have a clear idea of how much was out there or its distribution and abundance. We also wondered about the level of sand the hybrid would capture and the shape of dunes that it would form compared to its parents, the level of protection those dunes would provide from storms and sea level rise or flooding and erosion, how much carbon those dunes would store and sequester, and also how the hybrid might impact species diversity and conservation, and if that might differ from the impacts of its parents. So to answer some of those unknowns, I asked 3 questions as part of this master's research, and I'll take you through each one individually. The first one is about where the hybrid is and how much of it is out there. So what's the range, distribution, and abundance? And then we also asked this follow-up question that I'll talk about how hybrid abundance is related to its parent species abundance. Next, we investigated the hybrid's growth rate and also its functional morphology or traits important for its function compared to its parents. And third, we looked at the implications of the hybrid for dune functions and services, including sand capture and species diversity and conservation. So I'll start by talking about this first question in terms of the hybrid's range and abundance. And to answer it, I didn't do it alone. I worked with 5 awesome students over 2 summers. And in 2021, I was joined by Hugh Lee and Rose Ontaki. And in 2022, I worked with Cole Thiem, Beck Harper, and Drake Scrafford. And we searched so many areas of dunes together. This work wouldn't be possible without them, and they're really integral to the story. I also like to think that we were the inspiration for the first Dune movie, which suspiciously came out after our first field season ended. Strange. But I'll take you through how we searched for the hybrid across these dune sites. And we searched over 30 kilometers of dune, which is, I think of essentially as a dune marathon that we ran together. And at each of these search sites, we established these transects and we walked along them in this zigzag pattern. And we measured the amount of hybrid patches that we found along those transects. Sometimes the hybrid was really difficult to find. It's been described by Rebecca as looking for a hybrid or a needle in a haystack. And so we used several clues to ID the hybrid from far away and up close, including looking for tall and dense shoots, which we know the hybrid has from Rebecca's work and my work, which I'll talk about later in the talk. Also, flowering time. The hybrid flowers at different times than its parents. So we looked for the hybrid flowering when nothing else was at peak flowering. And then when we got closer, we confirmed the identity of the hybrid through its ligule, or that thin piece of tissue that I mentioned. And from the searches and the hybrid patches, we could calculate patch density across these searches. We also standardized the search length by splitting the searches up into roughly equal 0.2 kilometer segments. All right, and here I want to show you what we found across the coastline, which was a lot of hybrid patches. I mentioned there were 20 or so that had been detected in 2019, and as of last summer, we found nearly 300 patches, so increasing the number of detected patches by more than tenfold. And on the right, I'm showing a heat map of these 5 distinct sites where we find the hybrid, and you can see that the greatest densities of hybrid are in southern Washington. But I want to zoom into those sites and show you what we found there. Hybrid patches are shown in purple. And I'm also showing as offset lines from the coastline, areas where we searched in green and areas where we didn't have time to search in gray. And you can see that for most areas that were searched, we found quite a bit of hybrid at those areas. And what that tells me is that there's likely a lot more out there that we haven't found. So way more than this amount shown here. And I also want to point out this patch at the southern end of Grays Harbor, Washington, which is an area that we didn't search, but was just brought to our attention this week by 2 managers, Cindy Sundstrom and Larissa Flieger at the Shoalwater Bay Tribe up in Washington. And there's likely to be many more patches that are detected by researchers and also community members in the future. And then I mentioned that we asked this follow-up question about hybrid abundance. And I want to give a little bit more context to why we asked that question, which stemmed from observations that we made at these hybrid patches. We'd often find hybrid beachgrass patches, as shown here, surrounded by this whole sea of Ammophila breviligulata. So the dune was just covered in Ammophila breviligulata. And then nearby, we'd find sparse patches of Ammophila arenaria that were often present in much lesser abundance. And so from this observation, we wondered if Ammophila arenaria was a limiting factor in hybrid formation. Or what I mean by that is maybe Ammophila arenaria was only providing so many seeds and so much pollen needed for hybridization to happen. And so we hypothesized that potentially with greater amounts of Ammophila arenaria, we'd see greater amounts of hybrid beachgrass as well. To test this hypothesis, we also documented the number of Ammophila arenaria patches along these search transects and calculated the patch density. Now I want to show you a graph of a really zoomed out version of the amount of hybrid beachgrass and Ammophila arenaria that we found across sites. And again, I'm not showing Ammophila breviculata here because it's throughout the dunes. There's so much of it that it's not present in patches. And what you might notice here is that there's more Ammophila arenaria than the hybrid beach grass, and it increases as you move from north to south. The reason there's no data at Pacific City is because Ammophila arenaria is co-dominant with Ammophila breviculata, or there's so much of it that it's also not present in patches, and so to record the amount of patches would be impossible. There's less hybrid beach grass compared to Ammophila arenaria, but as you can see, it's greatest on average in southern Washington and especially Grace Harbor. But we know this isn't the scale at which hybridization happens. It often happens at a much more zoomed in, closer together area. So we wanted to take a closer look at the abundance of these two different taxa. What I'm about to show you is looking at a more zoomed in picture, and we used a generalized additive model, or a GAM, to look at the relationship between hybrid density and Ammophila arenaria patch density. And we did this because we noticed there was a nonlinear relationship between these two factors, and so this type of model allowed us greater flexibility in looking at these trends. And we also included sites as a factor in the model as well. And so here what I'm showing are the points which are the residuals of the model, but they're shifted by the value of the coefficients. But what you can think of them as is the raw data because of that shift. So hybrid patch density versus Ammophila arenaria patch density. I'm showing the trend line as well as the shaded region, which is the 95% confidence interval. And what you can see from this model is that as Ammophila arenaria patch density increases, so too does hybrid patch density. But there's a point at which hybrid patch density levels off at about 15 AMAR patches per 0.2 kilometers. But there is a positive relationship here. I want to point out that this relationship is relatively weak, so it explains only about 22% of the deviance in the model, suggesting that maybe there's other factors at play to this hybridization, or the factors that drive hybrid abundance. All right, so now we have an idea of how much hybrid occurs within its known range, and we wondered where it might occur beyond this range. And to do that, we looked at the overlap of the hybrid's parent species along the coast, which are needed for hybridization. But there's only so many areas of dune and sand that we were able to search. There's all this unsearched dune. We looked across maybe 1% of this potential coastline. And to search these other areas, we had this incredible resource to draw on, which is this community or citizen science project that had already been started in our research group. This community science project is an initiative that Rebecca started in 2020 in partnership with Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition, specifically their Coast Watch program with Jesse Jones. And Rebecca did all this engagement and training related to this project. I've been lucky to be part of it as well during my time in grad school. It's housed on iNaturalist, and anyone can post observations of the hybrid and its parents, as well as our native dune grass, Laemus mollis, to the project. And it's really big now too. So as of this month, there are over 1,200 observations from 750 plus different people. Most of them are the hybrid's parents, and specifically Ammophila arenaria. We've also been able to get out on the dunes and do trainings with many of these Coast Watch volunteers, or people actually looking out on the dunes as well. This footage is from a training that Rebecca did in 2021. I continued those trainings in 2022, and the project will live on with my current lab mate, Danielle Whalen, who will do more beach grass ID trainings in just a few weeks. So I feel incredibly lucky to be part of this and to have searched with these people. And so I mentioned that we were able to use some of these data to get an idea of hybrid parent co-occurrence. And how I did that was I looked through all those 1,200 observations, and I only included those for which we could be pretty certain of the beach grass ID, especially those that had a great ligule photo like is shown here. Thank you, Sedge Queen, who is one of the bigger contributors to the project. And now I want to tell you what we found from this data, or the overlap of its parent species along the coastline. This is what the zoomed out version of the map looks like. And there's a lot going on here, but you can see the hybrids currently known range in Washington and Oregon here. We use blue for Ammophila breviligulata and red for Ammophila arenaria. And I'll now orient you to the size and shapes that we use too. There are circles for all the iNaturalist data, triangles for observations that were recorded in this Hacker et al. 2012 paper, and the star from Rebecca's observation in San Francisco. And we also made points larger if they were more rare relative to the abundance of the other taxa. What we see from this map is that the parent species occur mostly where we expect them to. So we know Ammophila arenaria is dominant through California, although there are these select observations of Ammophila breviligulata. Both parent species occur within the hybrids range and through Canada, but there were some areas where we didn't really have a clear idea of the overlap, or especially on the zoomed in scale. For instance, I want to have an inset here of the west coast of Vancouver Island, which is showing a lot of both parent species up here. There's some really dedicated naturalists posting a lot of observations. And you can see that the parent species occur really close together. And so what this tells me is that hybridization up there is not only possible, but likely. And so the hybrid could already be up there and we haven't detected it yet, or there's the potential for it to occur in the future. So to summarize this first research question, we see that there's a ton of hybrid out there, more than expected, across most sites in its range. The hybrid has an abundance that's correlated with that of Ammophila arenaria, one of its parents, although there's likely other factors at play. And then the hybrid species, the hybrid parents co-occur at several areas outside of its currently known range. So future opportunities for hybridization are also possible. Okay, now transitioning to the second question about the hybrid's growth, as well as its functional morphology compared to its parent species. We looked at hybrid growth rate by measuring patch size through time, and we measured patch size by flagging the perimeter of the hybrid beachgrass patches and then walking around them with this high precision GPS backpack that was programmed to take points every 0.1 meters. And we measured patch areas in both 2021 and 2022, so we could look at changes through time. These are a few example patches shown here, and the patch names. And you can see that across these example patches, most grew, but they didn't do so uniformly. So there's some areas where the patches even shrunk because of things like sand burial or potential encroachment by the other beachgrass taxa. On average, we see that patches grew by about 30% after just a year's time. And we wanted to look at these averages across several spatial scales that we know might be important for hybrid growth. So we looked at these averages across sites. I'm only including the 4 northern sites here and not Pacific City, given that it only had 2 patches of the site. And you can think of the y-axis as this fancy percent change metric. What it actually is the ratio of 2022 patch size to 2021 patch size with a natural log transformation. And so we took averages across these sites. These are showing plus or minus standard error, and we did one-sided t-test to assess whether these values were significantly greater than 0, shown by the asterisks, which indicate significant growth after a year. And you can see that at 3 out of the 4 sites, there was significant growth. Grays Harbor likely has a lot of variability because of the high sand deposition on some of the patches at that site. We also wanted to look across another factor, which is dune profile location. So this is showing a cross section of the dune as if you sliced it in half and are looking at it from the side. And different areas have specific names in this field. So the toe closest to the beach, then the face, crest, and heel. And we know that these areas receive different amounts of sand supply from the beach as well, which may be important for patch growth. And so in looking at this metric across profile locations, we also see significant growth with slightly greater growth on average at the toe compared to the heel. Although I should mention there's no differences in growth between profile locations and between sites. But overall, the patches are growing. Now to talk about the second part of the second question, which is hybrid functional morphology compared to its parents. Again, functional morphology are traits such as shoot density and shoot height that are important for the function of an organism, or in this case, dune building and sand capture. And I want to put this in context by mentioning that Rebecca also looked at the functional morphology of the hybrid and its parents in several different ways, including through this common garden experiment that she conducted out at Newport, Oregon over 18 months. And this was this huge undertaking where she grew the hybrid and its parents together and separately in these bags. And when she looked at shoot density over time, she found that at the end of the experiment, the hybrid exceeded its parents on average in shoots, despite some variability you can see here. And she also found that the hybrid exceeded its parents in shoot height as well. And so we wondered if these differences would also be present across the hybrids range and across some of these different spatial scales that we're looking at. And to investigate this question, we used quadrats, or these 0.25 by 0.25 meter PVC squares, and we haphazardly placed those within and around the hybrid beach grass patches to measure the functional morphology, specifically shoot density, which you can see Cole measuring here, as well as shoot height, which he was measuring in this photo. All right, and these are our results of shoot density. There's a lot going on in this graph, but I'll orient you to what we're looking at, which is profile locations at the bottom. And here we've grouped together the toe and face locations, which is why the face isn't shown. Sites at the top from north to south again, and across taxa, which are the usual colors. This time Ammophila arenaria is the striped red. And we don't have any data for the Pacific City crest location because there's no hybrid patches present at this area. To analyze these data, we ran linear mixed effects models to look at differences in shoot density among sites, profile locations, and taxa. And we found several important things. One of the things we found was that shoot densities are greater at the toe and crest compared to the heel. Not a surprise, given greater amounts of nutrients and sand deposition at those sites. We also found interactions between site and taxa. And specifically, what we found is that at the two most northern sites, Ocean Shores and Grays Harbor, the hybrid exceeds Ammophila breviligulata in shoot height, or excuse me, shoot density, but not Ammophila arenaria. Whereas at other sites, the hybrid exceeded both of its parents in shoot density at Long Beach, or was equal to its parents in shoot density at Clatsop Plains. And again, we didn't include Pacific City in the model because it only had 2 hybrid patches. So ultimately, the hybrids exceeding at least Ammophila breviligulata in shoot density and sometimes Ammophila arenaria. When we look at shoot height across these same factors, we find similar results. Again, these graphs are really busy, but we ran the same models across these factors. Again, the Pacific City crest location is blank. And this time, what we found is similar, also that the hybrid exceeds at least Ammophila breviligulata in shoot height across most sites, sometimes Ammophila arenaria. And we also found interactions between profile location and taxa. So specifically, the hybrid and Ammophila arenaria are greater than Ammophila breviligulata at the toe and crest, but this effect is less pronounced at the heel. So lots of interactions, lots of things going on here. Slightly different results than the bag experiment in this more controlled environment, but interesting to look across these different spatial scales. So to summarize the second question, we see that the hybrid is growing over time after just a year when looking at its patch sizes. And we also see that the hybrid exceeds often Ammophila breviligulata and sometimes Ammophila arenaria in terms of both shoot density and shoot height. All right, now I will transition to this last question, which is about the implications of the hybrid for dune functions and services. First, I'll talk about sand capture, and then I'll discuss species diversity, and finally, species conservation. First, in terms of sand capture, we've noticed that the hybrid exceeds its parents in some dune building functional traits. And also through field observations, we often see that hybrid patches, especially at the toe and crest, present as these bumps, which are shown here, which indicates to us potentially taller shoots, but also maybe greater sand accretion. And this could be important for that biophysical feedback I mentioned earlier that leads to different geomorphologies. So we wondered potentially if the hybrid's dune building functional traits and its sand capture would lead to dunes produced that were taller and potentially wider than at least one of its parents. So this is geomorphology, but first we wanted to investigate sand capture of the hybrid. And how we did that was by looking at sand accretion across different transect areas, so regions that had the hybrid versus regions that didn't. We ran these GPS transects over the dune, so along these cross-sectional depictions, and we ran them through hybrid patches, and again, collected data using these GPS backpacks. And I'm about to show you a cross-section of example data that we collected. So this is what one of the profiles looks like through the hybrid patch. And we collected these data both in 2021 and in 2022. And we can isolate the areas of the transect that are just within the hybrid patch as well to compare regions. This is again showing cross-section, and now I want to switch to an aerial view of the transect. So if you were looking down at the dune from above. And this is what some of that data would look like. The X and Y axes are UTM easting and northing, but you can think of them as kilometers west to east and kilometers south to north. And this is a transect running through the hybrid patch. And we wanted to be able to compare it to areas not just within the same transect, but across the dune. So for each of these transects running through the hybrid patch, we also ran these parallel paired transects some distance away. And we called these different transect types, so with and without hybrid beach grass. And from this, we can compare these same areas within that hybrid patch interval across transect types. And we also wanted to be able to compare regions along the transect, so right before and right after the hybrid patches. And we did that by establishing different transect sections for the pre-patch, within patch, and post-patch intervals. Across these 6 different transect regions, we calculated 2 different metrics to look at sand accretion. One was the change in elevation, and I'll just give you a zoomed in picture of what that looks like here. And this is just the vertical distance between transect points in 2022 versus 2021. The second metric we calculated was the change in area across these same years. So considering not just the vertical change, but also the width of the patches. Now I'm about to show you our results for sand accretion, and I'm showing transect section on the x-axis, type of transect with the with hybrid patch transects colored purple. And then we also know, again, that different profile locations receive different amounts of sand supply from the beach, which may be important for this elevation change metric. And so we grouped our results by profile location as well. Here's what they looked like. And I want to point out, first of all, that the y-axis is positive. So typically, most areas of the transect are showing accretion or they're getting larger. We also ran 3-way ANOVAs to look at change in elevation among sections, profile locations, and type. And we found no difference in elevation change among the type of transect with hybrid or without hybrid. So we're not seeing a strong signal of hybrid patch presence yet. However, we do see that the toe and face is receiving or showing greater elevation change than the crest and heel, which makes sense again due to the sand supply differences. And that elevation change decreases as you move across transect sections at the toe and face, so from pre-patch to within patch to post-patch sections. But so far, no strong signal of hybrid patch presence. Then in looking at the second metric, which is area change, it shows similar patterns. So there's positive values on the y-axis, the dunes are growing. Again, there's no significant difference in transect type in determining area change, but you can see slight differences on average, especially for the crest and heel locations. And again, there's greater area change at the toe and face than the crest and heel. So again, no strong support for this hypothesis that there's greater sand accretion after just a year within hybrid patch areas, although more differences might be detectable over longer timescales or through more controlled environments. Okay, I mentioned multiple dune functions and services that the hybrid might affect. And the second one that I want to talk about is plant species richness associated with the hybrid beach grass. And we measured that within the same quadrats in which we looked at functional morphology of the hybrid and its parents. And specifically, we looked at species richness per quadrat of any non-beach grass species among quadrats dominated by each of the 3 Ammophila taxa. And one of the things you might notice is that the y-axis is low in value. So there's typically only up to 2 other plant species in quadrats dominated by the beach grasses. This is what those averages look like. There's greater amounts of native species than non-native species in the quadrats, but we see no significant differences in species richness among these 3 types of quadrats, although there are slight differences in the averages. These results, although they were collected in different ways, are consistent with those of this Hacker et al. 2012 paper, where they found that Ammophila arenaria exceeded Ammophila breviligulata in plant species richness. Although this isn't starting to think about the mechanisms of how the beach grasses impact species richness, just correlation. So other factors might be at play, such as profile, location, or latitude. Okay, and then the last thing I want to talk about in terms of this question is the hybrid's proximity to threatened bird habitat, specifically of these 2 threatened birds, the western snowy plover and streaked horned lark. And there are specific areas along the Pacific coast that are designated as critical conservation areas for these 2 species by the Fish and Wildlife Service and Oregon Parks and Rec. And so we wondered about mapping the proximity of the hybrid beach grass to these threatened bird areas, not yet starting to think about the hybrid's impact on the birds, but just looking at proximity and co-occurrence as a jumping off point. And so we show hybrid patches in blue, or in purple, I'm about to show insects, and then critical habitat areas from the Fish and Wildlife Service of these 2 bird species, as well as western snowy plover management areas from Oregon Parks and Rec, which are only in Oregon. And here is what those insets look like at those same 5 sites that I've shown throughout the talk. And what we can see is that the hybrid already occurs within this threatened habitat at multiple areas in Grays Harbor, at Midway Beach, and Graveyard Spit in Grays Harbor, and also at Long Beach, Washington at Ledbetter Spit. And the hybrid is found near, but not yet within these areas at Ocean Shores, Hotspot Plains, and Pacific City. And so this could be potentially really concerning when thinking about these areas where managers might want to limit the beach grasses and promote habitat for these threatened bird species. All right, to summarize this question, which talks about all these different dune functions and services in the hybrid beach grass, we see no difference in sand accretion observed under hybrid beach grass patches compared to the areas around them after a year. We see slight but not significant differences in species richness dominated by the 3 different beach grass taxa. And we find that the hybrids found near and within threatened bird habitat across these sites. Now I just want to zoom out a little bit and talk about the implications of the hybrid to wrap up this talk. So specifically, first mentioning the hybrid spread and potential range expansion, as well as its growth and competitive ability, and finally, its impacts on dune shape. So starting with its spread and range expansion, one of the take-home messages from this research is that there's way more hybrid out there than we anticipated. It's all across the coastline. And we know from this community science data, as well as other papers, that other opportunities for hybridization exist beyond the hybrid's current range. And to add to these findings, I want to mention some Rebecca's results from the 3rd chapter of her PhD when looking at the population genetics of the hybrid beach grass. What she found when she looked at the hybrid's genetics was that its population was composed of first generation hybrids, where Ammophila arenaria and Ammophila breviligulata are breeding together. Second generation hybrids, or F2s, where two first generation hybrids breed together. And Rebecca also found evidence of backcrossing, where the hybrid is breeding again with one of its parents. And this suggested to her that there is a hybrid swarm underway, which is a very scary but scientific term. And when thinking about it in terms of the hybrid's range along the Pacific coast, it tells us that there's likely more hybridization events to be expected in the future. And those could be composed of these different classes of first generation, second generation hybrids and backcrosses. My work didn't involve any of this genetics, but I did collect all these tissue samples or plant samples from hybrid plants throughout its range. And so there's potential opportunities here for future research with these samples. Okay, the second implication I want to talk about is in terms of the hybrid's growth and competition. And first, I'll mention that another finding from Rebecca's bag experiment was that the hybrid competes with both of its parents, especially Ammophila breviligulata. And we know that the hybrid is greatest in density at these sites in southern Washington, and this is where Ammophila breviligulata is dominant. Adding to this is that my research showed that the hybrid beachgrass patches are expanding after just a year's time, which is a pretty short time scale in ecology. And so these results about the hybrid's competitive ability, as well as where it occurs and the patch growth, suggest that we're likely to see more expansion of hybrid patches in the future, especially where it's surrounded by Ammophila breviligulata or these open sandy areas. And this could be especially concerning where we might want to limit the spread of the hybrids, such as for these birds in these threatened habitats. Okay, finally, I want to talk about the implications of the hybrid for dune shape. Even though we saw that the hybrid exceeded its parents in some dune building functional traits, this didn't translate into greater sand accretion under hybrid patches after just a year's time. And so we're still wondering about the potential shape of dunes that the hybrid may form. But I also want to mention this incredibly cool experiment that's happening out at Nehalem Bay, Oregon, that's run by Megan Wengrove with co-PIs Sally and Peter Ruggiero. And this is this large-scale common garden experiment where we planted the hybrid together and separately with its parents in these large experimental plots. This is a huge, super collaborative experiment, and I am grateful to have been a part of it at several different steps in my grad career. And this will help inform species-specific differences in sand accretion and dune shape produced by the grasses. It's still early days for the experiment, but we're already seeing differences in sand capture in the plots. And this paper was one that we published this year with lead author Canton Laporte-Ferret in Coastal Sediments. It's a conference paper. And so we're likely to see more differences over time as the experiment evolves, which could also have implications for coastal protection, as well as carbon storage and sequestration by the dunes. So ultimately, I hope I have left you with this take-home message that there's a lot of hybrid beach grass out there. It's not going anywhere. There's likely to be more of it in the future, and it has really important implications for how we manage the dunes and how we interact with them. Thank you. Yeah, now I want to talk about my favorite part, which is all the people who have helped develop this master's project and who have contributed to it in some way, starting with my committee and first my advisor, Sally. I so appreciate you welcoming me into the dunes and giving me this greater appreciation for and understanding of these coastal ecosystems, especially the first year in the pandemic, which was a challenging time. I was also so fresh out of undergrad, and I learned so much over these last few years, including the fact that scientists don't get royalties from publishing scientific papers. Had no idea. Thank you to the rest of my committee too for their support and input along the way, especially to Peter for the introduction to coastal geomorphology. I also want to thank my funding sources, Oregon Sea Grant and the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. The support has made such a difference in the research that I've been able to do and the thoughtfulness with which I was able to do it. I especially am grateful for the fellowship of the Northwest CASC, which really transformed the way I think about science that's actionable and equitable. I also want to thank all the managers who I've worked with who have shaped this research and who have provided access to or facilitated understanding of the areas where they work. I hope this research is helpful in some way. I'm also so glad to have been part of this community science project with Rebecca and Jesse, with Coast Watch. I'm really grateful for this collaboration, as well as all of the people who have contributed to the project or who I've been able to meet on the dunes or on iNaturalist. I also want to thank the 2 teachers who I worked with as part of the Oregon Marine Scientist and Educator Alliance. It was so great to be able to work with you and co-create this hybrid beachgrass curriculum, which was so challenging, and to be able to see it implemented in the field with your students. I want to thank again the students who I worked with across these 2 summers. Again, none of this work would be possible without them. And working with you all was such a highlight of my degree. I feel so lucky for all of the dune adventures and camp meals that we shared over these 2 years. I've also been able to work with many other folks in the field or through dune collaborations, and this really shaped my development as an interdisciplinary scientist, and I'm really grateful for all these collaborations and field support, especially from the Wengrove Lab and the Nearshore All-Stars. It was also incredibly cool to see the different types of fieldwork that you all do. Then I want to point out some of the weird and cool things that we found in the dunes over the years. This is such a weird ecosystem, and we found many things, including stuffed animals, a lot of boots and clothing, a pirate flag, a lot of bugs, and a very suspicious dune hole or dune crypt. I also want to thank the Department of Integrative Biology. I think I missed this picture because I was doing fieldwork, so I've added myself in another seamless Photoshop job. I especially want to thank the office staff, Tara, Trudy, Melissa, Teresa, and Tracy. I'm so glad to have been able to work with you all, and you're such amazing advocates for grad students. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank Ricardo too, who's the Zoom moderator today and has also been the Zoom moderator for 5 or so years of defenses in IB. We really appreciate you. Oh, I want to thank the Hacker Lab and all their pets who are so amazing and who have provided mentorship and support and friendship at every step of the way, from welcoming me into the lab and introducing me to the system, and also sharing an office space in Cordley and now in a cubicle space in this other office building that we're in. I have so loved joining you on your fieldwork trips, and I'm grateful that you've come on mine. It has been so great to commiserate about stats and writing woes when I needed it most. And yeah, I love all your pets as well, many of whom I've dog or cat sat, Zuko, the cat not shown here. And I'm glad to call you all friends in addition to calling. I'd also like to thank all of the friends and community I've made while at OSU and in past years. Somehow through the pandemic, some of you may have gotten a little more than you bargained for in terms of grass and sand facts, but I appreciate the support regardless. I've loved all the camping adventures, tide pooling, running races that we've done together, many dinners, and I'm looking forward to planning more. And you all remind me what's important every day and keep me grounded. And I feel so lucky to have you in my corner and to be yours too. And then there's my family who are scattered across the US and who I haven't been able to visit nearly enough, especially during the pandemic. I'm grateful not only to my parents, but to my wonderful extended family as well, some of whom are here today. You all have such a positive impact, made such a positive impact on my life, and hope to make you proud every day. And I'm so glad to be able to share a piece of this research with you as well. Okay, now I'd love to take any questions from the audience. Ricardo.
Thank you so much, Risa. Yeah. Question for Risa? Yeah, right.
It says, amazing thought. My question is, did you get to make friends with any of those cute puppy birds?
Great question.
Maybe this.
Sure. Yeah, I think you said it should be close enough, but I'm happy to repeat too, especially if I need more time to think about it.
It was left, it was left.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, I have not been able to see any plovers over the 2 years. We in 2021 saw what we thought were plovers, but they were sadly not. Some other shorebird. But they are definitely cute and have been described to me as a cotton ball on toothpicks by a manager. Yes. Or sorry, Sally,
Oh,
can you
no, no,
facilitate the questions? Okay.
I think earlier the mentioned how like the dune grass for like the invasive species have changed the landscape of dunes.
Yeah.
And like it almost seems like it kind of became like a climate like adaptive, like for climate change, but rising like levels, sea levels. And so I was like wondering if there's any like is there plans for like restoring the landscape, like for native species or you know, like just the invasive species around for that purposes.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It was about the beach grasses as a tool for climate adaptation, but also wondering about areas of restoration for native species. There are specific areas along the coast where certain managers, such as the Fish and Wildlife Service or Parks and Rec, have restored dunes specifically for native species habitat, and those are often called habitat restoration areas in Oregon. So they've graded the dunes, they've limited the beach grass, and there's more open area for plants to establish and for birds to nest. So it's pretty, unrealistic, I think, to think of dunes across the coastline as not having beach grasses, but there are specific areas that are hopefully refuges for these native plants and animals. Yes, pardon.
Another question, it says, what is the management implication that you foresee due to beach grass hybridization?
Sure. Yeah, one, I think I talked about several, and one of the big ones I think is for these native species. So if the hybrid beach grass does exceed its parents in shoot density and height, and we're also seeing that it's really persistent from this Nehalem experiment as well. It has really high survival rates. And so potentially in thinking about limiting the beach grasses, the hybrid could be a challenge to limit the spread of it in these habitat restoration areas. And the beach grasses are also planted continuously for dune stabilization along the coastline. And so it's unlikely, I personally think that the hybrid will be planted as part of this, but potentially the hybrid could also be used as a dune stabilizer, especially if it accretes more sand than its parents. Yes, Zach.
Wonderful talk. Really, really well done. I had a quick question or a couple questions about the species diversity that you found in association with the hybrid and its parent.
Yes.
So you showed a figure that like maxed out at an average of 2
Yes.
species. And does that include the parent grasses or the hybrid grass as part of the diversity? And then what are the native plants that might be more associated with the species? So that's the ones pictured there.
Yes, that's a great question. Yeah, these are some example ones. To start with your first question about if species richness includes beach grasses, it does not. So species richness is only the non-Ammophila taxa. And some of the different species that are in these quadra are shown here. This is yellow sand verbena, beach pea, and pearly everlasting are their common names. These are some of the more common ones that we find in the quadrats, especially beach pea. Sometimes we also find the native grass, Lamus mollis, but I haven't yet looked at like if there's any association of certain native species with each of the beach grasses. I would guess it would be on too zoomed in of a scale to see that effect.
Thanks.
That question. Yeah, Liz, in the back.
So the hybrid was discovered, I think it sounds like in 2012, and the 2 beach grasses were introduced. It sounded like roughly 200 years ago or 100 years ago. Do Do you think that the beach grasses had been hybridizing before they were discovered in 2012, like long before? Or if it was closer to around 2012, and if so, why did it take 200 years for them to start hybridizing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thinking about the age of the hybrid, if it's as old as the introductions of its parents, or if they're hybridizing more recently. Yeah, I think we often think of dune species as potentially being there as early as when the dune was formed. So I think it's really, really likely that the hybrid was there well before 2012, potentially as old as the dunes and when the two parent species overlapped on them. But we also know that the hybrid can't be older than the dunes on them. So these hybrids at the leading edge of dunes that are building out are likely younger than hybrids way in the back of the dunes, which have been there for many more years. But yeah, it's a new discovery, but it's been likely happening for a while. And it's only confirmed in 2021, 2 years ago. So we're just a little over 10 years after finding this hybrid. But again, short time scale for ecology. Thanks for that question. Yeah,
Have they found hybrids in other regions of the world? I'm assuming these grasses occur other places.
Yeah. The question was where else, if anywhere, that they found hybrids. This co-occurrence between Ammophila breviligulata and Ammophila arenaria is actually the only overlap in the ranges that we know about in the whole world. So the beach grasses have been planted widely and occur across many coastlines, specifically Ammophila arenarias all over the coastlines. But there's no other area where we know that they overlap.
Why? That seems crazy. Is it?
I think a lot of it is potentially due to climate. Ammophila arenaria has this really high climate tolerance. It can grow at so many places, but Ammophila breviligulata is often limited by things like temperature, which is why part of the reason why it doesn't grow through California.
Okay.
So climate is one reason. Maybe it just hasn't been introduced yet as well. There's potential for them both to establish in the area. Yeah, Chris.
First of all, thanks for the talk. Amazingly done. And the imagery is beautiful. Just how you organize up your slides is amazing. But if you're forced to have another year in beach grasses and you didn't have to ask anyone for money, you have the money, you could do it. What would be your next question?
Oh, I love that question. Yeah, if I could do anything with another year of study, what would I do? Well, it'd be interesting first to look at these sand accretion data over longer time scales. A year isn't that much. But one of the follow-up questions that came out of Rebecca's work with this population genetics and seeing that the population was composed of first generation, second generation, and back crosses, as well as different parentages of the hybrids. So different parent species providing pollen versus seeds. One of the follow-up questions was about if those different groups of hybrids have different morphologies. So for instance, if like first generation hybrids have different traits than second generation hybrids, or if hybrids produced with Ammophila arenaria as the mother plant had different traits than ones formed with Ammophila breviligulata as mom plant. So many more questions. Thanks. Okay. Other questions?
All right. Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you so much, Risa, for a wonderful talk. And let's give her a round of applause again.
Thank you. All right. Nice talk. Great to share.